Okay, welcome everybody to the August meeting of the monthly presentation of the Institute for Historical Study. This month we have Pam and Patricia and Liz, I don't know why I keep calling her Pam, Pat and Liz, presenting on First Ladies and Women's Rights from the Jacksonian era to the Civil War, which is 1829 to 1861. Before I introduce our speakers, I just want to point out that we have these meetings every month on the second Saturday of the month at 10 a.m. Pacific time, except December, and that I have meetings scheduled for the rest of 2025, that's what we're still at. However, 2026 is completely open. So if anybody on this session would like to volunteer or to do a presentation, please let me know at dankoh@allmail.net. The only requirement for the presentation is that it has to be something that could be of interest to people who are interested in history. That's about as broad as I can make it. So, let's see, Pat is an independent scholar with degrees in library and information science and gerontology and psychology. And she's currently writing an annotated timeline of women's rights from colonial times, a glossary of the women's movement, and related essay. Liz, who incidentally is the president of our society this year, is retired recently from being a branch manager at a public library. She has published articles and chapters on First Ladies of the United States. And she's currently writing a biography of Abigail Powers Fillmore. It's an interesting name there, Powers and all. She's an inaugural lifetime individual member of the First Lady for the correspondence of Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore. And as I understand it, the president of the correspondence board is joining us today. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Liz and Pat with a suggestion that we please mute ourselves until the presentation is done and we can start asking questions. Pat, the floor is yours, and Liz, the floor is yours.
So Liz and I are working on the project, as Dan said, to tell the intertwined stories of First Ladies, the evolution of the office of First Ladies, and the evolution of the women's movement. And we've been doing it through a series of talks over the last few years. And one of the things that I found that as I was going back and forth through time, through these various talks that we've been given, is I've seen a lot of gaps in the history. And they puzzled me. And I wondered why we have one story of the movement, and yet we have so many diverse groups of women. And why are women so divided in the various ways? And the sad irony I have come to find studying this particular era is that the model that we have does not match the history of a majority of women in this country. It never did. But it did profoundly affect society's views of women and how women view themselves. So these views have actually echoed into the present. And this is why I would like to tell the story of these different groups, because each group has brought into the present and even into the White House the memories and experiences of their many times great grandmothers and their own experiences. And they have shaped the 20th and 21st century women's movement. What has happened is that there's been a New Englandization and classing of women's history. And Hunter Vermeer has written that the terms like Republican motherhood, the cult of domesticity, redemptive womanhood have become familiar themes for students in their respective periods. However, some scholars have criticized these popular frameworks for their New Englandization, for being overly representative of Northern women's experiences. So setting the stage for the antebellum period. The antebellum period has been variously measured from 1815, the end of the War of 1812, to 1860, 1861, 1830 to 1861, and so forth. Our time period is 1830, or 1829 rather, with the inauguration of Andrew Jackson, to 1861. It was a period of religious revival, which led to social reforms. The economy during this time moved from a subsistence to a for-profit economy. Invention and innovations in communications and transportation, industry and agriculture were exploding. In fact, Hamilton thought that industry would actually balance agriculture. And he wrote in his report that they complemented each other. There was an expansion across the continent, and it was viewed as a moral imperative. There was increasing polarization between the North and the South. The Mexican-American War and the beginnings of the Indian Wars. It was a time of. I'm sorry, I'm getting static here. There was an increasing gap between the haves and the have-nots. And this is the first time we elected a president who was not from the original 13 colonies. There was an extension of voting rights to more men by the removal of the real property requirement for many states. So there were a series of attitudes and assumptions about women, and there's a few here, but I'm just going to note a few. A woman's primary desire and goal in life was to be married, and all women will marry. And this carried through a lot of assumptions about a woman's life. A married woman is the ward of her husband. The women's sphere is the home and the church. She is to be seen but not heard in public. And women are the guardians of morality and virtue. A woman's virtue included piety, subservience, purity, and domesticity. Women were physically and mentally unfit to function in the public sphere. So let's meet the ladies. The story of this nation during this period is the story of different geographic, cultural, economic, ethnic, and even linguistic groups of individuals. And so, too, is the story of the women's movement. So first we have the white upper northern women, urban, and these women are the middle class and wealthy. So the theme of the trophy wife and the little woman come from about this time. So the difference, of course, is the wealthy have more resources and more leisure time. They also have more education. Ladies' academies are burgeoning during this time. The middle class directly managed household affairs and very often worked with their maids or cooks and raised the children without benefit of governesses or nannies. They were also deeply involved in church activities. One cynical observer noted of an upper class woman that their purpose was to flaunt her husband's conspicuous wealth with conspicuous consumption. But there was discontent among these women. They were already chafing under the various limitations of the cult, that is the cult of domesticity, and they began pushing the limits of the private sphere through social events for fundraising, for charity, because that was permissible as long as they did it in their homes or in a church. They participated in abolition and temperance as long as it was in the parlor or a church and with other women. Katie Stanton would define these limitations as the fourfold oppressions, and these included government, religion, economics, social, and I might add, fashion. Fashion was extremely constricting and confining. Until 1920, the upper classes played a very crucial role in the women's movement. They provided leadership, resources, and financial support, contacts, and prestige. They provided places for meetings, both public and private, as well as organizational skills. So the next group is the slave-owning white woman in the South. And there's been a lot of recent literature on this. One is they were her property, and ties that bound about first ladies and slaves. And the myth of the Southern woman is that they were unaware of the brutality of slavery. Because they were subject to coverture, they could not benefit or participate in the trading of slaves. The tragic reality, according to Theresa Logan, is slavery gave white women in the South significantly more economic independence than those in the North, and they regularly used this freedom with remarkable regularity. Women in the North could only dream of such economic independence. And this is very true. When they were children, they were given slaves that they would take with them into their marriages. And the husband could not, under law, in any way interfere with them. If he tried to sell them or punish them, the woman had every right to interfere. Women also took their husbands to court if that happened. And it was not the common law court, it was the court of chancery, which did recognize women as individuals, legal entities. And very often they would win their cases. And there's the reading of some of these cases is rather interesting. A lot of this other material comes from the WPA project, the Writers Project, that interviewed slaves and former owners. The National Archives has tickets and court transcripts, which make some rather interesting reading. So in 1839, the Married Women's Property Law was passed in Mississippi to explicitly give women ownership status over enslaved individuals, and other slave states followed. Women were involved in nearly a third of all slave transactions, and this is according to letters of slave traders and documents, bills of sale. And it might explain a little bit of Mary Todd's Lincoln response to a suffragist. And it turns out it was the opinion of many women of her time. As if we women in America were not the fullest possession of every right. The movement seems to me, however, one of those that should be treated with wholesome neglect. She was expressing this opinion of, that women did have, a majority of women did have, that they had every right and they didn't need any more, and that these women were just troublemakers. Free African American women, a much overlooked, very neglected group. We've had free African communities in this country from colonial times. These women and their families lived in segregated society because the nation was segregated. Many had enslaved relatives in the South or had been enslaved themselves. They were working women. They had jobs outside the home, but they also participated in abolition groups, fundraising for charitable causes. They were often conductors in the Underground Railroad if they were in the right location. They petitioned against local discriminatory policies and practices, and they also supported runaway slaves. They cared for family and community members. They were deeply religious, and it was primarily to the AME, or American Methodist Episcopal Church. Often they were the sole or major support of families, as Black workers, skilled and semi-skilled, had problems finding jobs, and white workers were very resentful. They worked as domestic, street vendors, cooks, clerks, and some even owned tea rooms. They founded educational societies and libraries. I could just get this out of my way. Okay. Enslaved Black women found ways to carve out space for themselves that challenged scripts of gender. This is Alexis Ogame, and I'm mispronouncing his name. Slave women are everywhere and nowhere. And he was describing the difficulty of researching their stories. It's a group that is rarely discussed in terms of women's rights history, but their experiences, knowledge, and memories passed down from mother to daughter or elder woman to younger woman influenced the modern women's rights movement, particularly the 60s movement of Black women's rights activists. Women slaves were very much aware of their economic value. That is, their own value and the value for their ability to bear children. They were strongly religious, but their religion was kind of was a mix of their beliefs from their homeland, from where they were taken, and Christianity. Slaveholders felt it was their Christian duty to convert their property. However, it was to a kind of Christian, plantation Christianity. We had a church with white preachers, and they told us to mind our master and missus, and we would be saved. If not, they said we wouldn't. And that was the Christianity they had preached to them. Women adapted beliefs, medical lore, and rituals rooted in their culture with Christianity into a pragmatic faith. They practiced both the visible and invisible religion. The visible religion was the public religion, but the invisible was secret and secret practice in the woods or in a home. And one slave described as having a pot always set sideways against a door, and that was to hide the sounds of their services. They survived and received asserted themselves by creating communities. They formed networks for mutual aid and escape planning. They provided stability and continuity in an uncertain world. This was a world where people could just disappear. Children were sold away from their parents, or mothers were sold away from their children. They were also a source of knowledge and medical care. Resistance. These women did indeed resist in very subtle or extreme ways. And throughout this period, there were a number of slave rebellions in the South, which put Southern slave owners very much on their guard. They used knowledge of herbs to regulate their cycles. Younger women used subtle and extreme forms of resistance, as I said. They might plead pregnancy or to lighten a workload, and then plead miscarriage also to lighten a workload. They participated with others in work slowdowns, and they participated directly or indirectly in rebellions. They escaped or aided other slaves to escape. The more extreme cases were aborted pregnancies, which was a crime, infanticide, and that was viewed as a way of saving their child from a life of slavery. One Margaret Garner was such a slave, and when she was caught, she was executed. Poisoning slave owners, and there are stories in newspapers of cooks poisoning their families. White families. One case was 1857 of a woman named Josephine in Mississippi. The farming women again are rarely touched on, and yet they would form the basis of our pioneer women. In theory, the farming society observed a two-sphere model. The men's sphere included farm management. I'm sorry? Farm management, work in the fields and woods, plowing and harvesting and construction. The women's world included all domestic tasks, child rearing, the garden, small animal care, textiles, caregiving, and dairy management. Some tasks, however, were done by both.
If you think she's hungry, bring me something to give her.
I'm sorry?
I don't know, because she ate it.
Please hold questions until after the presentation. There'll be plenty of time for questions.
Is there a question?
Someone is unmuted. Please mute.
Someone's got their mic on. Everybody mute.
Okay. So when necessary, they both the men and the women would do chores together or exchange chores, and women very often would be in the fields. This is a story of a man who's met a farmer's daughter and is extremely impressed by her versatility. That when she goes out and does work outside, she changes her clothes and her shoes. She comes back in and puts on another dress and becomes very ladylike. He is very, very impressed by the fact that she can work in almost two worlds at once. So working women, and this was a tricky one actually to do. So I thought I would start with the factory woman. But the Industrial Revolution has really two stages. And the first stage is the mill stage. And the Lowell Mill Girls are the ones that stand out, though they were not alone. In 1821, Francis Lowell purchased farmland near Merrimack, the Merrimack River, and he built mills for his reverse engineered power looms. His was probably the first case of industrial espionage, where he brought back memory of the specifications of the British mills and had Paul Moody design power looms here in the United States. And they formed the basis of the textile industry here. He also built a planned community for mill girls to live and work in. He hired corporate recruiters to enlist farmers' daughters who were perfectly willing to leave subsistence farming to earn money. And they were fairly well paid for the standards of the day, $3 and $3.50 a week. By 1843, 30,000 women had left farms. This is in the New England states area to work in the 10 mills of what they called Spindle City. Life was regulated by a ringing of bells, which is slightly medieval in my opinion. Church attendance was mandatory. Improper behavior was a cause for firing. They worked from 12 to 14 hours a day on a 6-day week. However, this golden experiment did end, and as we reached stage 2 of the Industrial Revolution. But also there was a combination of increased competition from other mill consortiums and a desire for higher profits. And they pushed the women to work faster and speeded up the machines, which created more, which actually led to more accidents. There was cotton dust in the air, and plus little and no ventilation led to brown lung disease. And the increased deafening noise levels also were affecting women. I think what really got to them, however, was the increased rents in their boarding houses. So by 1834, the girls formed the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association. This is one of the first women's labor movement in the country. They would succeed with varying strikes throughout the next few years, and they would, but their era did end. By comparison to what was to come, it was almost idyllic. It was in the country. But factories started being built in the cities, and they were now heavy industry, steel making, though that would come much later, but at the end, about the late 1850s. But heavy equipment would be made here. Women would continue, but now they were immigrant women working primarily in the garment, shoe and boot and other light industry factories. However, the Industrial Revolution did open up jobs in offices. So there was a phenomenon that happened in this area of work, the feminization of work, and we would see it later in the professions. Jobs such as secretaries and clerks were initially men's jobs, and as the work became repetitive, machine facilitated or tedious, or as someone said, boring, women were hired. Clerical workers such as typists, file clerks in new companies, and started to appear. So there's the example of a male secretary would soon devolve into a lady typist, and so on. The typewriter itself was invented a little bit later. So women would become machine operators as well. The telegraph, which was invented during this time period, opened up another group of jobs. So retail opened up. The city downtowns became financial service and shopping hubs. By 1857, the first full department store opened, the Arnold Constable department store. The motto was everything from cradle to grave. And women found work as sales clerks in these new stores and boutique shops, or wait staff or kitchen staff in tea rooms in restaurants. Professionals, by the 1850s, women were emerging as teachers, professors in women's colleges, nurses, midwives, news reporters, and writers. The domestic service continued. That's the kind of old fallback for women. They entered service in private homes. They worked as maids, cooks, and ladies' maids. But they also would hire out their services to several clients. So they might do laundry for a group of people, or cooking, or cleaning, or childcare. Pioneer women. Pioneer women had probably the most uncertain and dangerous of life next to the enslaved woman, particularly on the trail. They might arrive at the trail's end a widow or without their family. They came from diverse backgrounds, such as other countries, small towns, farms, plantations. Some were single women traveling with families, others, mothers, daughters, even slaves with owners. The wagon train journey was viewed as an adventure by many young women who viewed it as an opportunity for freedom from social constraints. Older women tended to try to maintain a traditional life until it proved impractical. The opportunity and means of survival. Women found various ways to earn a living in the West. They provided domestic services, which I described earlier. They would manage and own bathhouses, which was a new industry, might manage or even own restaurants and hotels. Women pursued untraditional work as well, such as mining, or as ranch hands or cowgirls. Some used the trip to create a new identity. Black pioneer enslaved women sought to escape from slavery. And one example is Biddy Mason, who sued for and won her freedom in a California court. And she went on to become a wealthy woman and philanthropist. So here's a picture of the ladies. There's the gold miner here, the cowgirl, and various other ladies in their various garbs. So there were a number of influences during this time period. So events, innovations, movements, beliefs influenced the nation's history and evolution of the women's movement. So the first was the Second Great Reawakening, and I'm going to go through them one by one here. The Second Great Awakening was an evangelical and religious revival movement that swept the nation. It gave rise to social reform movements such as abolition, temperance, prison reform, and humane treatment of the mentally ill. The last two come a little bit later. But abolition and temperance are really the first two. Abolition was considered a little radical, but temperance was considered socially acceptable. So the beliefs of this movement included a rejection of the Calvinist belief in predetermination. It preached that salvation was up to the individual, and individuals have a Christian duty to spread the word of Christ, the word of salvation. Salvation could be achieved by good works. Preachers and ministers no longer needed to go to a seminary or get a degree in divinity. Preachers needed only a spiritual and visionary experience and authorization from another minister or preacher to preach. The Second Great Awakening for women, however, did open up a path out of that private sphere. It recognized women as ministers, and between 1794 and 1850, some 100 women preachers crisscrossed the nation. One of these was Duranda Lee. You see her up here in the corner. It gave permission for women to speak out against slavery as a part of their role of upholders of morality. There was a belief that female slave ownership degraded the woman who owned the slave. The restriction, however, to speaking out was that be only in a parlor or in a church. Society women and a new class of women, academic women, were stepping out of their sphere. Manifest destiny and westward expansion. These are a direct result of the Second Awakening. It was the belief that American values and institutions are superior. It was also a belief and a duty to spread American beliefs and institutions. The odd twist that many slaveholders also felt it was their manifest duty to convert their slaves to the plantation Christianity. But it also coincided with the depletion of soil due to the overplanting of cash crops in the South, cotton, and overplanting of crops for export in the North. Women who moved west often found new freedom in dress and identity. Here's a picture of her manifest destiny. The abolition movement. The abolition movement has the most intimate relationship to the women's movement. The women activists were also a part first of the abolition and the temperance movements. Lucretia Mott, Katie Stanton, Barbara McClintock, and I've misspelled it here, the Fortan sisters, and others organized Seneca Falls. Abolition women called upon themselves and others to identify with Black female slaves. Participation in the anti-slavery movement gave women a sense of self-efficacy. It taught them organizational skills. It created a national and local networks and even international networks. It gave them experience coping with violence, as they sometimes would. But it also instilled confidence in individual activists. The first female anti-slavery organization was founded in Salem, 1832, by a group of women of color, the Salem Female Anti-Slavery Society. 2 years later, it extended membership to white women. Abolition organizations supported women's rights by it gave women a sense of self-efficacy and taught them organizational skills. It shared resources and networks. It shared their skills and their strategies. It also shared their male support community. And it also shared platforms for public speaking. So they're really quite crucial to the women's movement. To the Industrial Revolution stages 1 and 2, trying not to go over ground I've gone over before. However, during that first stage of the Industrial Revolution, factory work was viewed as beneficial for poor women. Men were too valuable at that time, working the land to be spared, and women were recruited into the new textile mills. This is the period 1820s to the 1840s, and where they earned a comparatively good salary. From the 1840s to the 1850s, this would change with stage 2 and heavy industry. However, the Industrial Revolution was not quite finished with women. It provided new opportunities for women, albeit not necessarily better working conditions. By 1860, it was estimated that 10 to 15% of women were in the workforce. The market revolution, not often mentioned, the economy moved from a subsistence to a profit economy. Westward expansion and more land for cash crops added for export to other nations. So it also created a new underclass. There was a centralization of manufacturing once done at home, transforming women from being a producer into a consumer, robbing her of her economic value to her family, which was, they had economic value, particularly in the colonial and New Republic days. The sad irony is that most women continue to be financial supports of working class families. It was a kind of women's liberation, as one person put it, liberation from work for the upper classes. So media and newspapers were a primary source of information and news. They gave platforms to women's rights, abolition, and the abolition movement, but also to other social reforms. They formed a communication network. For example, the Charleston Mercury, a conservative paper, would publish a northern paper's editorial and then respond in that same issue with an opposing opinion or cartoon. Two very important voices for the movement were William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator and Frederick Douglass's North Star. Two spheres philosophy. It was the belief that God ordained that men and women inhabited two separate spheres and realms of society. Catherine Beecher, a sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe, described it as follows. The men's realm consisted of public life, politics, business, ambition, and achievement. The women's realm was private, spiritual, home, family, persuasion, living for others, and subservience. It involved the cult of domesticity, the cult of womanhood, divine economy, redemptive motherhood, and redemptive womanhood. So the lasting shadow of the two spheres, it has had the longest impact on the national psyche. I apologize for that. It survives today as the double standard. It became a guide for how a lady behaves. It also established a binary view of the sexes that does not recognize LGBTQ genders and fosters prejudice. In its day, it was honored more in the breach, however, than in the practice, and women used it as an ideal for proper behavior, but not necessarily as an inflexible code of behavior. The Haudenosaunee, and I'm mispronouncing that, Confederacy was the oldest democracy in America. It was admired by the founding fathers, who actually used many of its precepts in the Constitution. It was also a real-life inspiration for Lucretia Mott, who stayed a month with the Seneca, where she saw a lacrosse game between women, studied women exercising authority and sharing power and decision-making with the men of the Seneca. Likewise, Katie Stanton frequently sat across from the dinner table from Oneida women during her visits to her cousin, Garrett Smith. She wrote, "The women were the great power in their societies. The descent of property and children were in the female line." Matilda Gage, Jocelyn Gage, studied the nations of the Confederacy and later was adopted into the Wolf Clan of the Mohawk Nation. She served on the Council of Matrons. She wrote, "The modern world is indebted for its first conception of inherent rights, natural equality of condition, and the establishment of civilized government upon this basis." The cruel irony is that their inspiration and the admiration of the feminists, the Haudenosaunee, and other women of color were excluded from the women's movement. So before Seneca Falls, Lisa Tetrault, who wrote The Myth of Seneca Falls, stated, "The 1848 meeting, so far as we know, was the first meeting explicitly called to demand women's rights in the United States. This does not, however, mean that the meeting began the movement. Women's anti-slavery convention was organized by the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society in New York City in 1837. It was attended by 175 women from 10 states, representing 20 anti-slavery groups. Its motto was, we abolition women are turning the world upside down." And that was written by Angelina Grimke. Unfortunately, I wish I could say more on her. Committees were formed to contact absent women, the anti-slavery societies that hadn't attended. And according to Anne Gordon, this was the first time women discussed women's rights. The publication was an appeal to the women of nominally free states, issued by an anti-slavery convention of American women. In 1838, a second conference was called in Philadelphia, and its motto was, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" And this is the logo here. Due to racial tension and threatened violence, the mayor asked that only white members attend. Though fearful, Black members did attend, and violence did occur. In 1839, the conference elected a delegate to the 1840 Anti-Slavery Conference in London. In 1840, the Anti-Slavery Conference in London, Lucretia Mott tried to, was denied seating due to her gender. The denial turned out to be a catalyst in the United States to form a separate women's organization dedicated to women's rights. This is the first time we see an organized movement coalescing. The Seneca Falls Convention. It was a convention called to discuss social, civil, and religious conditions of women, and was called by women of Seneca County, New York. It was held in the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls, July 1848. Organizers were Lucretia Mott, Katie Stanton, Mary McClintock, that's the way it should be spelled, Martha Wright, and Jane Hunt. 300 men and women attended. The proceedings are as follows. On day one, only women attended, and there were speeches by Lucretia Mott and Stanton. There was a reading and discussion and editing of the Declaration of Sentiments, and debate over the propriety of men signing the Declaration. On day two, men attended as well, and the discussion and approval of the Declaration of Sentiments. Lucretia Mott closed the meeting with a final resolution, which was in response to a reading by one of the men of excerpts from Blackstone's who's a jurist on the inferiority of women. There was a feeling that men should stand up and defend the most egregious charges against them. And so they played devil's advocate. So Lucretia Mott resolved that the speedy success of our cause depends upon the zealous and untiring efforts of both men and women. The Declaration of Sentiments. One newspaper called it the Second Declaration of Independence. It was originally called the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. Frederick Douglass wrote that it was the grand movement for attaining the civil, social, political, and religious rights. It was based on the Declaration of Independence. The grievous section listed 16 examples of oppressions of woman by man, such as inequality and denial of suffrage, property rights, divorce, marriage rights, economic and educational opportunities. It also mentioned of taxation without representation for single women. So the excerpt reads, and this is one of my favorite ones, is, "He has usurped the prerogative of Jehovah himself, claiming it is his right to assign for her a sphere of action when that belongs to her and to her God."
Excuse me for interrupting, but I understood this was supposed to be a lecture about the first ladies.
Yeah, that will be coming up.
Oh, okay. It's very interesting to see this review, but I was waiting for.
No, it's a good comment. It might actually change the way we present this in the future. So resolve that such laws as conflict in any way with true and substantial happiness of woman are contrary to the great precepts of nature and of no validity for this is superior an obligation to another. There were 12 resolutions. A woman is a man's equal and was intended to be so by the Creator, and the highest good of the race demands that she should be recognized as such. Resolution 9, that it is the duty of women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to elect a franchise. Many objected to this. They said it would make the movement look ridiculous, and others said it was too radical. Frederick Douglass, however, persuaded the objectors, and it did pass. The irony is that the one resolution that caused the most debate lent its name to the movement into an era. The Seneca Falls controversy. Of the 300 attendees, only 100 signed the declaration, and some of the 100 withdrew their names from a publication. It excluded poor and Black women and ignored the issues faced by these women. A recent controversy centers around the idea that Seneca Falls was the origin and birthplace of the women's rights and suffrage movement. The myth of Seneca Falls also eclipsed many and erased some of the women's activists from history. So the legacy of Seneca Falls: the women's rights are the rights of human being and must never be reduced below the standard. It was in a letter written by Maria Barney to the 1850 National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts. It was organized by Lucy Stone and others, and attended by 1,000 delegates from 11 different states. Unlike Seneca Falls, it was national. It addressed African American issues and organized action committees to make plans, and then set up annual meetings to follow up on that progress of those committees. Let's see. It also added rights not covered in the Declaration of Sentiments, such as equal wages, expanded education and career opportunities. And there were many, many speakers, as opposed to the 2 or 3 speakers from Seneca Falls. One of them was Sojourner Truth, William Garrison, and Frederick Douglass. There were annual meetings until 1860. In 1860, Katie Stanton and Antoinette Brown Blackwell called for marriage reform legislation to give women the right to separate or divorce from a husband who was drunk and insane, or a deserter or cruel. As the Civil War drew nearer, women of both North and South focused on supporting their side. Women's rights activists focused on emancipation. Katie Stanton and Susan B. Anthony founded the Women's Loyal National League, which raised funds for Harriet Tubman's rescue work and the Underground Railroad, and called for the immediate end of slavery and full citizenship for freed slaves. They also supported the United States Sanitary Commission, which raised funds and sent supplies to the Union Army.
Okay. Thank you, Pat, for that excellent overview of women's history and women's rights from the Jacksonian era to the start of the Civil War. Let me bring up my PowerPoint here. Let's see. Okay, can everybody see that slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. I will now discuss the presidential wives and White House hostesses of that time. These photographs of the former exhibit in the First Ladies' Hall of the Smithsonian Institution show representations of most of these women in their actual gowns. The administrations are represented in chronological order from right to left, with Emily Donelson of the Jackson administration at the far right, and Harriet Lane in the foreground in her white wedding dress, center left. As Pat pointed out, the women of this era lived in the age of the cult of domesticity, also known as the cult of true womanhood, and the presidential wives and surrogate White House hostesses of the time were no exception. Most were religious, several were domestic, but some were not submissive. As I present their lives, I will emphasize women's issues, slavery, and other social justice matters, as well as historic firsts and notable changes in the role of the First Lady. Rachel Donaldson Jackson was the wife of Andrew Jackson, who became the 7th U.S. president. Although she never presided at the White House, she left a legacy that impacted subsequent First Ladies. Born in Virginia in 1767, Rachel moved with her family to Tennessee when she was 12. In 1785, she married Louis Robards in Kentucky. In 1791, Rachel, hardly a woman submissive to her husband, escaped this unhappy marriage by eloping with Andrew Jackson, a circuit lawyer she met at her mother's boarding house. Reportedly believing that Robards had obtained a divorce, the Jacksons later learned that it had not been granted until 1793, making Rachel not just an adulteress, but a bigamist. They married legally in Tennessee in 1794. Over the years, Andrew fought duels in defense of Rachel's honor. In 1815, during the War of 1812, General Jackson triumphed over the British at the Battle of New Orleans, boosting American morale and thrusting Jackson into the national spotlight, setting the stage for his future presidency. Democrat Andrew Jackson, nicknamed Old Hickory, was nominated for president in 1828 against the incumbent president, National Republican John Quincy Adams, in a rematch of the 1824 presidential race. John Quincy Adams was a New England native, heir to his father, President John Adams, and a member of the elite Eastern establishment. Andrew Jackson was the new rustic Westerner, frontier fighter, and champion of the common man. During the Bitter campaign, the opposition used Rachel Jackson's history as an adulteress, bigamist, and divorcee, hardly the ideal life of a, quote, true woman, unquote, against her and Andrew. Printed in a pamphlet was the question, quote, ought a convicted adulteress and her paramour husband to be placed in the highest offices of this free and Christian land, unquote. This first presidential campaign to exploit the personal past of a candidate's wife revealed public expectations for the ideal qualities of a first lady. After her husband's election in November 1828, Rachel, paraphrasing Psalm 84, stated that she would, quote, rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God than live in that palace in Washington, unquote, a sentiment shared by other reluctant first ladies. Although Rachel planned to attend the inauguration, she died from a heart attack at the Jackson home, the Hermitage, in Nashville, Tennessee, in December 1828, the month following the election. Her death led to an era of proxy or surrogate White House hostesses. Okay. Concurrent with the attacks on Rachel Jackson's character during the 1828 campaign were the attacks on Margaret O'Neill Timberlake. Margaret, born in 1799, was the daughter of a Washington boarding house owner who hosted many prominent political figures, including in 1824, Rachel and Andrew Jackson, who both liked Margaret. Andrew, impressed by her political insight and willingness to express her views, declared her the quote, smartest little woman in America, unquote. Outspoken, flirtatious, and worldly, Margaret was not considered ladylike. While her husband, U.S. Navy purser John Timberlake, was away on a voyage, Margaret's closeness to and frequent companionship with his friend John Eaton led to rumors in Washington of adultery. Timberlake died at sea in April 1828, and just 9 months after his death, Margaret married Eaton on January 1st, 1829, violating the expected etiquette of a widow mourning her late husband for at least a year. This scandal would not have had historical ramifications were it not for the fact that Andrew Jackson named his friend and supporter, John Eaton, to his cabinet as Secretary of War. Elite Washington society had to accept the electoral victory of the Western common man presidential candidate, Andrew Jackson. It had been denied the opportunity to shun Rachel Jackson due to her untimely death, but it took full advantage of the opportunity to ostracize Margaret Eaton. In what came to be called the Petticoat Affair, the women of Washington City, as it was then known, exercised their social power in a negative way against another woman and disrupted the politics of the new Jackson administration. Prior to Jackson's 1829 inauguration, the wife of Vice President John C. Calhoun accepted a social call from Margaret Eaton, but in a calculated snub, refused to return a social call as protocol dictated. Weeks later, at the inauguration, other new cabinet wives refused to acknowledge Margaret. More politicians' wives and Washington hostesses soon did likewise. President Jackson viewed the attack on Margaret's character as similar to that on his beloved Rachel, and interpreted the social rejection as part of a larger political conspiracy against his administration. At a cabinet dinner in September, Jackson vigorously defended Margaret Eaton's reputation, even offering affidavits proving her innocence. But the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, who had defeated the British in war, was no match for the women of Washington. Secretary of State Martin Van Buren, a longtime widower whose wife Hannah had died way back in 1819, earned the president's favor by showing Margaret respect. The petticoat affair dragged on until 1831, when Van Buren and Eaton offered their resignations from the cabinet. Jackson then announced he wished to reorganize his entire cabinet and asked all the cabinet members to resign. The Eatons left Washington when Jackson named John governor of the Florida Territory. 2 years later, Eaton was made ambassador to Spain, and Margaret accompanied him there. Margaret Eaton died in 1879, age 79, in Washington, D.C. An era of proxy and usually young first ladies began with the death of Rachel Jackson. Only one previous president, Thomas Jefferson, had been a widower when he entered office, and his daughters and the wife of his Secretary of State, Dolley Madison, acted as White House hostesses. Emily Tennessee Donelson, the niece of Rachel Jackson, was born in 1807 in Donelson, Tennessee. Emily enjoyed a thorough education, first at the Lebanon Road Schoolhouse in Nashville, and then at the Nashville Female Academy. She married her cousin, Andrew Jackson Donelson, in 1824. They had 4 children. Emily, impressed by the quality of education provided to young women at the Georgetown Visitation School, which was run by Catholic nuns, encouraged relatives to send their daughters out of Tennessee to enroll at the school, and stated that a solid course of study for women, quote, ought to be prized above everything, unquote. Emily Donelson's strict sense of propriety caused her to follow the lead of the cabinet wives and socially snub Margaret Eaton. As a courtesy, Emily welcomed an initial social call from Margaret and then returned one as protocol dictated. She invited her to the White House at the president's request, but in defiance of her uncle, the president, she would not lend her own personal support to Mrs. Eaton in order for her to be more widely welcomed in Washington society. During the time Emily Donelson served as Andrew Jackson's hostess in the White House, his daughter-in-law, Sarah York Jackson, the wife of his adopted son, supervised the management of the Hermitage. A fire at the Hermitage in October 1834, however, brought Sarah to the White House, where she and Emily Donelson essentially served as co-hostesses, a unique situation in White House history. In 1836, with Emily suffering from increasingly poor health, Sarah filled the role of White House hostess on her own. Emily died of tuberculosis in 1836 in Nashville, Tennessee, at age just 29. Sarah died at age 82 in 1887, also in Nashville. Angelica Singleton Van Buren was the daughter-in-law of 8th President Martin Van Buren. Born in 1818 in South Carolina, Angelica Singleton was educated at Madame Reload's French School in Philadelphia, where she was nicknamed Queen Angelique. In Richmond, Virginia, she was first introduced to the role women were increasingly beginning to play in organizing and managing public charities. For instance, a fair on behalf of parentless children. In 1838, Angelica married Abraham Van Buren, the oldest son of Martin Van Buren, who had become president in 1837. They would have 4 children, 3 of whom lived to adulthood. The young couple visited Europe in 1839, where the English court of the young Queen Victoria impressed Angelica. As White House hostess, Angelica adopted a European-inspired tableau approach at the 1840 New Year's Day reception, sitting stiffly with bouquets in her lap, forgoing the traditional Democratic handshake, a practice many found too regal for the United States. The Van Burens left the White House in 1841, living at Lindenwold, the Martin Van Buren home in Kinderhook, New York, and later in New York City. In 1853, Angelica offered refuge to her sister Marion, who had escaped her abusive second husband. South Carolina law had required Marion to transfer ownership of the property and assets of her first husband to her new husband, which she attempted to regain through state courts with little success. Angelica, enraged by the decision, tried to intervene, but found that her political connections were unwilling to help, illustrating the difference between influence and actual power. Marion had no legal recourse due to her gender. During the Civil War in 1861 to 1865, Angelica assisted prisoners of war on both sides of the conflict, including raising funds to purchase blankets for Confederate prisoners held in a Union prison in Elmira, New York. Angelica died in 1877, age 59, in New York City. Anna Symmes Harrison was the wife of 9th President William Henry Harrison. She was born in 1775 in New Jersey. The first president's wife to receive a formal education, Anna attended the Clinton Academy in East Hampton, New York. In New York City from 1787 to 1791, the teenager lived at the boarding school of Isabella Marshall Graham, a feminist who believed in a woman's right to equal education and a social activist. Anna married Captain William Henry Harrison in 1795 and went on to have 10 children. In Indiana in 1811, Territorial Governor Harrison won the Battle of Tippecanoe against tribal forces led by the Shawnee leader Tecumseh. Harrison, nominated for president, and John Tyler, nominated for vice president by the Whig Party in 1840, won the election with the slogan and song Tippecanoe and Tyler Too. During the brief 4 weeks of the Harrison administration in 1841, daughter-in-law Jane Findley Irwin Harrison served as hostess at the White House, where she held 2 receptions. President Harrison died of pneumonia after only 1 month in office, after delivering the longest inaugural address on record. At age 68, he was the oldest man to be sworn in as president until the inauguration of Ronald Reagan in 1981 at age 69. Anna had not yet moved to Washington City, and she became the first and thus far only First Lady since Martha Washington never to live in the White House. Anna held the record as the oldest woman to become First Lady at age 65 until Jill Biden, age 69, in 2021, and she served the shortest amount of time. Anna helped raise her grandson, future President Benjamin Harrison. She died in 1864 in Ohio at age 88. Letitia Christian Tyler was the first wife of 10th President John Tyler. Born in 1790 in Virginia, she married attorney and state legislator John Tyler in 1813. He would become governor of Virginia and a U.S. senator. They had 8 children, 7 of whom survived infancy. Letitia generally deferred to her husband, but she made one significant exception when he suggested sending their eldest daughter to a Catholic school, which Letitia, as devout Episcopalian, adamantly refused. As a plantation mistress, she forbid women slaves from performing work outside, including working in the fields, bringing the concept of separate spheres and the cult of domesticity to the Tylers' enslaved female servants. John Tyler became president in 1841 after the death of William Henry Harrison, the first vice president to succeed to the presidency upon the death of the incumbent. Letitia, disabled by a stroke in 1839, usually stayed upstairs in the White House, reading her Bible and her prayer book. There, authors Charles Dickens and Washington Irving were welcome to meet her. She delegated hostessing duties to her daughter-in-law. In 1842, Letitia suffered a second stroke and became the first president's wife to die in office. Priscilla Cooper Tyler was the daughter-in-law of John Tyler. She was born in New York City in 1816. An actress, she met John Tyler's son, Robert, in Richmond, Virginia, where she was playing Desdemona in Shakespeare's Othello. They married in 1839 and went on to have 9 children, 6 of whom lived to adulthood. After Letitia Tyler's death in 1842, Priscilla became the first actress to serve as First Lady, 139 years before former actress Nancy Reagan became First Lady. She was also the first woman acting as First Lady to travel with the president as an official member of the presidential party, accompanying John Tyler to Boston for the dedication of the Bunker Hill Monument in June 1843. The Tyler administration ended in 1845. Priscilla died in 1889, age 73. Julia Gardner Tyler was the second wife of John Tyler. She was born in 1820 on Gardiner's Island, New York, and educated at Madame Ségérè's Institute for Young Ladies in New York City. For decades, this broadside poster from 1840, featuring the Rose of Long Island, Julia Gardner, was assumed to be a commercial advertisement for a dry goods store that Julia had willingly posed for, an inappropriate and unladylike action in the mid-19th century. Since the poster's discovery in 1939, some historians have called her saucy, complicit, publicity-seeking, a minx, and even a coy exhibitionist. However, recent research performed by Sharon Leahy revealed that Julia did not pose for this broadside. In fact, she was caricatured in it. These types of lithographic caricatures often sought to confine women to their proper sphere and ensure they displayed proper behavior. Evidently, the lithographer had seen Julia daily promenading down Broadway with a man he did not realize was her father. The statement on the placard she is holding, "I'll purchase at Bogart and McComley's, number 86 9th Avenue. Their goods are beautiful and astonishingly cheap," is saying that she is beautiful, but her seeming behavior, overdressed and flouncing down the street on the arm of a dandy, made her cheap. The publisher of the lithograph, Alfred E. Baker, was soon indicted for libel by the French consul, whom he had also caricatured. Upon his conviction, the court ordered the lithographic stones on which his caricatures were etched and all confiscated prints destroyed, which is one reason only one copy of the Julia Gardner lithograph apparently exists. The Tyler President Tyler, the first president to marry while in office, wed young Julia Gardner in New York in 1844 and went on to have 7 more children with her, making him the president with the most children. Before the establishment of the Federal Civil Service in 1871, the wives of presidents and other government officials fielded patronage requests, playing a crucial role in filling government positions. Julia enjoyed acting as a conduit for presidential favors and government appointments, unlike at least one of her successors, Abigail Fillmore, who felt besieged by office seekers. The Tylers left the White House in 1845. In 1852, the Duchess of Sutherland and 500,000 other British women endorsed the Stafford House Address to the Christian Women of America, the largest anti-slavery petition ever assembled, urging Southern women to support the abolition of African-American slavery. Julia's reply in early 1853 in the Southern Literary Messenger declared that England had no right to dictate policies to the United States, and that slaves in the American South, who were cared for by their plantation mistresses, were better off than white factory workers and sailors in England. She also justified the role and lifestyle of the idealized Southern woman, whose sphere was the home. Julia believed that the special nature of women, their sympathetic hearts susceptible to all stories of real or imagined distress, disqualified them from being legislators. Yet she also argued that Southern women were well-versed in politics. Despite growing up in the North, Julia believed it was not morally wrong to own other human beings, as there had been slave labor on her family's Gardiner's Island before slavery was outlawed in New York State. Julia Tyler died of a stroke in 1889 in Virginia, age 69. Sarah Childress Polk was the wife of 11th President James K. Polk. Born in 1803 in Tennessee, she was tutored by the principal of the Bradley Academy that her brothers attended, and she rode on horseback hundreds of miles to attend the Moravian Female Academy in Salem, North Carolina, the best girls' school in the South. She married Tennessee state legislator James Polk in 1824. They had no children. Childless, Sarah put her intelligence to the service of her husband and his career. Unlike many first ladies who preceded her and succeeded her, she fully shared her husband's ambitions to rise in national politics. To that end, she quietly and privately became a manager of his public schedule and his correspondence, and an advisor to him. She once stated that she always took, quote, a deep interest in state and national affairs, unquote. Sarah accompanied James to Washington while he served in the U.S. House of Representatives, living in a boarding house and frequenting the House of Representatives. The friendship of Sarah's family with President Andrew Jackson strengthened the bond that James Polk, who would be nicknamed Young Hickory, had with his mentor. In 1829, at the beginning of the Petticoat Affair, Sarah sided with the cabinet wives who ostracized Margaret Eaton. However, during the 1831 congressional season, Sarah, not wanting to harm her husband's favored status with Jackson, remained in Tennessee, wisely avoiding the ongoing crisis. The Polks were successful in staying in Jackson's good graces, which factored into Polk's election to the powerful position of Speaker of the House in 1835. James became governor of Tennessee in 1839. During the presidential campaign of 1844, there is speculation that opponent Henry Clay's wife would make a better First Lady than Mrs. Polk because Mrs. Clay was good at housekeeping and butter making. In response, Sarah rejected domesticity, confidently stating, quote, "If I should be as fortunate as to reach the White House, I expect to live on $25,000 a year," which was then the president's salary, "and I will neither keep house nor make butter," unquote. Following her husband's inauguration as president in 1845, Sarah served as an unofficial secretary to him. She disguised her role as advisor to her husband with conventional ladylike manners, discreetly discussing political issues with others, and routinely introducing her remarks by suggesting they were the opinions of the president. She supported her husband's goal of fulfilling the manifest destiny of the United States through territorial expansion to the West Coast, which led to the Mexican-American War in 1846. Sarah was viewed as a powerful influence on her husband. Vice President George Dallas commented, quote, "She is certainly the mistress of herself, and I suspect of somebody else also," unquote. The Polks brought some of their slaves to Washington to work in the White House. Sarah did not believe that all men were created equal, nor chose their fate, but that each person was created for the place he or she occupied in life. The Seneca Falls Convention for Women's Rights was held during Sarah Polk's tenure as First Lady, but she ignored the women's movement at the time. In later life, she opined, "It is beautiful to see how women are supporting themselves, and how those who go forward independently in various callings are respected and admired for their energy and industry. It is now considered proper for young ladies, when they leave school, to teach or to do something else for themselves," unquote. The Polks left the White House in 1849. James died just 3.5 months later. Sarah's 42-year widowhood is the longest of any First Lady. She died in 1891 at the age of 87. The daguerreotype picturing the Polks together is one of the earliest of a presidential couple. Margaret Smith Taylor was the wife of 12th President Zachary Taylor. Born in 1788 in Maryland, she married Lieutenant Zachary Taylor in 1810. They had 6 children, 4 of whom lived to adulthood. For 40 years, Margaret lived in a succession of frontier outposts, accompanying Zachary whenever possible, as he rose in the ranks of the U.S. Army. He would later remark, quote, "My wife was as much of a soldier as I was," unquote. Beginning in 1843, Margaret became a founder of the Episcopalian Parish and Church of St. James in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which still exists. In 1847, during the Mexican-American War, Major General Zachary Taylor, old, rough, and ready, led his troops to victory in the Battle of Buena Vista. Nominated for president by the Whig Party in 1848, he won the election and was inaugurated in March 1849. As the president's lady, Margaret Taylor practiced domesticity, focusing on the maintenance of the executive household, while her daughter, Betty Taylor Bliss, took up hostessing duties. Margaret also practiced piety, attending morning services at St. John's Episcopal Church, welcoming a Baptist Sunday school group on the 4th of July, 1849, and accepting an honorary lifetime membership in the American Sunday School Union at a ceremony in November that year. In 1850, President Taylor died unexpectedly from gastroenteritis. Margaret Taylor died in 1852 in Mississippi, age 63. Margaret is the only First Lady with no undisputed portrait. In contrast to James Polk, who was photographed with his wife Sarah, Zachary Taylor was painted with his warhorse, Old Whitey. In contrast to Margaret Taylor, there are several undisputed portraits of Old Whitey. It is telling that the era that includes the most poorly documented First Lady is also the era of a nascent women's movement in which women began to collectively and publicly advocate for their rights. Abigail Powers Fillmore was the first wife of 13th President Millard Fillmore. She was born in New York in 1798. She began teaching school in her teens and taught at the New Hope Academy in the Finger Lakes area of central New York. Both she and her future husband were mostly self-taught. Abigail married attorney Millard Fillmore in 1826. She continued to teach, making her the first lady to work for wages before and after marriage. He went on to become a New York State Assemblyman, a U.S. Congressman, and the Comptroller of New York. The Fillmores lavished the formal education they never had on their two children. Son Powers attended Harvard, and daughter Abby attended Miss Sedgwick's School in Lenox, Massachusetts, run by the sister-in-law of novelist Catherine Sedgwick. Abby later attended the New York State Normal School in Albany in order to become a teacher like her mother. In 1848, during the same summer as the Seneca Falls Convention, Millard won the Whig nomination for vice president on the ticket with presidential candidate Zachary Taylor. A newspaper joked that if women did have the vote, they would vote for the handsome vice presidential candidate. Millard became vice president in 1849. When Millard Fillmore unexpectedly became president on the death of Taylor in 1850, he found that there were no books, not even a Bible, in the White House, mindful that his wife, the new First Lady, wanted a library. The president successfully requested funds from Congress to start the first official White House library. Abigail took pride in the accomplishments of American women writers, her fellow countrywomen, as she put it, and she enjoyed reading Harriet Beecher Stowe's anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. The Fillmores supported social activism by women, including that of their friend Dorothea Dix, the mental health care reformer. The Fillmore women divided social duties. Abigail hosted visitors to the White House whenever her health would permit, including in 1850, the Swedish nightingale Jenny Lind and her manager, the impresario P.T. Barnum, and in 1853, literary lions Washington Irving and William Makepeace Thackeray. Abby paid calls, including to a quite elderly Mrs. Alexander Hamilton. Abigail died in Washington of pneumonia less than a month after leaving the White House in 1853, age 55. Jane Means Appleton Pierce was the wife of 14th President Franklin Pierce. She was born in New Hampshire in 1806 and was afforded a high-quality education, attending Catherine Fisk's Young Ladies Seminary in Keene, New Hampshire. She married Democratic Congressman and later U.S. Senator Franklin Pierce in 1834. They would have 3 sons, none of whom reached adulthood. Of the Pierce's sons, one died 3 days after birth, another died of typhus at age 4, and Benny, their last remaining child, was killed before their eyes in a train accident just 2 months before Franklin's inauguration in 1853. Jane's aunt, Abby Kent Means, served as White House hostess while Mrs. Pierce was in mourning, one of the rare instances of an older proxy first lady. Ever pious, Jane spent time in the Fillmore White House Library, reading the Bible and Thornton's family prayers. She urged White House staff to attend religious services. During the Pierce administration, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed residents of new territories to vote on the issue of slavery, leaving the question of whether to enter the Union as a free or a slave state up to popular sovereignty. Franklin was a good friend of slave-owning Jefferson Davis, his Secretary of War and future President of the Confederacy, while Jane's uncle, Amos Lawrence, a wealthy Massachusetts cotton magnate, offered financial aid and support for the anti-slavery settlement that still bears his name, Lawrence. The law led to violence in the Kansas Territory, which became known as, quote, Bleeding Kansas, unquote. Jane played a part in rescuing from prison Dr. Charles Robinson, the leader of the anti-slavery Free State settlers in Lawrence, who had been indicted in 1856 for treason by pro-slavery courts. His wife, a distant relation of the Lawrence family and therefore kin to Mrs. Pierce, sent Jane a letter in which she claimed that the Kansas governor had warned that Robinson was to be tried, convicted, and hung. Jane interceded with her husband, and Dr. Robinson was eventually freed. Jane's aunt, Abby Kent Means, supported the Normal School for Colored Girls, founded by Myrtilla Minor in Washington, D.C. in 1851. Riding in the president's carriage, Mrs. Means often visited the school, a notable recognition that probably held in check the hatred of the mob that was at times, quote, threatening and troublesome, unquote, to the school. Despite Jane's anti-slavery leanings, Mrs. Robert E. Lee, the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington and the wife of the Confederate general, observed of her, quote, "I have known many of the ladies of the White House, none more excellent than the afflicted wife of President Pierce. Her health was a bar to any great effort on her part to meet the expectations of the public in her high position, but she was a refined, extremely religious, and well-educated lady." The Pierces left the White House in 1857. Jane died in 1863 in Massachusetts, age 57, of tuberculosis. Harriet Lane was the niece of 15th President James Buchanan. She was born in 1830 in Pennsylvania. Harriet became an orphan at age 10, and her bachelor uncle, U.S. Senator James Buchanan, became her legal guardian. She attended the oldest Catholic school for girls in the original 13 colonies, the Georgetown Visitation School, the same school that Emily Donelson had praised. Uncle and niece forged a political partnership. James welcomed Harriet's presence when he conducted political meetings and discussed legislative initiatives, international negotiations, or business matters. James Buchanan's extensive political career included stints as Secretary of State in the Polk administration, and during the Pierce administration, Minister to Great Britain. Queen Victoria gave "Dear Miss Lane," as she called her. The Queen described Harriet as ladylike and not at all like an American, the rank of ambassador's wife. Political colleagues credited Harriet's social skills and political savvy for helping to advance her uncle's steady rise in politics. A Democrat, James Buchanan was elected president in 1856. Following his inauguration in 1857, Harriet's charm and diplomacy helped ease social tensions in the years leading up to the Civil War. Because the term, quote, "president's lady," unquote, referred to the wife of a president, a new term was devised for Harriet, the first woman to preside at the White House for a bachelor president. Harriet Lane was the first woman presidential family member who was called, quote, "First Lady in the Land," unquote, in public print on March 31st, 1860, in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. The press also referred to her as the Democratic Queen. In a pen drawing published in a British Illustrated magazine, Harriet was depicted with her uncle during his presidency. This was the first known instance of a first lady being portrayed in a public activity during her incumbency. Buchanan's term ended in 1861. Based on what she had been told, Harriet assumed her successor, Mary Lincoln, who hailed from Kentucky and Illinois, was, quote, "loud and Western," unquote, revealing a lingering Eastern disapproval of those from states in the West. Harriet married banker Henry Elliott Johnston in 1866. They had 2 sons, both of whom died from rheumatic fever in their teens. Following the deaths of their sons, the Johnstons addressed the need for an institution that cared for chronically ill children, regardless of race, creed, or the ability of the parents to pay. They incorporated the Harriet Lane Home for Invalid Children in Baltimore, Maryland in 1883. In 1903, Harriet died of cancer at age 73. In 1912, the Harriet Lane Home opened at Johns Hopkins University, the first pediatric hospital associated with an academic research institution. Her legacy survives as the Johns Hopkins Children's Center Harriet Lane Clinic. And thank you all for listening to our presentation. And do you have any questions?
I don't have any questions, but I'd like to thank you both for a fascinating presentation. I appreciate, Pat, how you showed us the wider roles that women played throughout the different eras, the enslaved women, the mill girls, the pioneers, the immigrant women. In taking notes, what I wrote down was women's resilience in history. You know, this, I mean, don't we just love history? You know, this is, I sure hope that this presentation is available on a website or a YouTube page, because I really want to watch it again. It is so rich with information about how women throughout history have carried such a weight and have showed such resilience. And then Liz, then you wrapping it up with all the first ladies gives us a clearer sense of how women navigated the public and the political space. So thank you both. It was awesome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tammy.
Thank you.
I was curious why you, of all these different women, why did you choose to focus on Abigail Downs Fillmore yourself?
Myself, because I'd heard from the time, I've been interested in the First Lady since I was a child, and I'd learned that Abigail Fillmore founded the White House Library, and that as a librarian, that got me very interested in her story. So started researching her. Thank you.
I see.
And the Fillmores had their own extensive personal library as well. And so they're book lovers, and being mostly self-taught, they learn much from books. So.
Is there a group, you know, a formal or informal, of women or people who are researching wives of presidents? Or
There's just started a few years ago, FLARE, FLARE, First Ladies Association for Research and Education.
oh
That's
wow.
when there's also a National First Ladies Library and Museum.
Huh.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful source of information, the library.
Hi, Liz.
Hi.
I have a quick question. There's a book out recently about the different presidents and what they like to have for dinner or serve to their guests. Do you know anything about the women and their food preferences?
That's a great question, because there's a First Lady historian, Carl Anthony, who I think he's researched that, and I believe there is actually, I think, Margaret Clapthorne, who actually was, I think, a curator, I believe, at the First Ladies exhibit at the Smithsonian. She actually wrote the First Ladies cookbook. So that's a great question.
Yeah, I do know that Dolley Madison's favorite was oyster ice cream.
Yeah.
Interesting choice, yeah.
Yeah.
Carl Anthony online actually does write a number of what would you call it, social, you know, a pop culture type articles, and he does write a little. He did write an article about food at one point, and he even wrote about president's cats at one point too. So you might want to check that out. Carl Anthony online.
Liz, could you please unshare your screen so we can all see
Okay,
it?
sure.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go.
So
I can see everybody.
I was interested in the fact that so many of these first women, even if they had to work their way up, were educated. We don't know the level or what the type of education was in the various academies you mentioned, but you know, if women had a certain status, they were educated fairly well. That would just put them in a position for opinions and whatever.
Well, I think Ida McKinley might have been one of the first ladies who actually had an education equivalent to a male education.
Uh-huh.
Her father insisted on that.
Oh, yeah.
And she insisted on that. But the other first ladies did, you know, the academies evidently did provide a fairly good education.
Yeah.
And they took it from there, those who were interested, like Abigail Fillmore, for example, and Sarah Polk. They were amazing readers.
Mm-hmm. Good for them.
They just seemed hungry for it.
I have a question for Pat. Yeah, for Pat. Back in the beginning, you listed a whole series of antebellum attitudes toward women. And I'm wondering, to what degree was this special to the United States as opposed to Europe, more developed in the United States, more misogynist in Europe or the US? Anything you can give us on the comparison between the two?
Yeah, I have not, I have to admit, I have not made a study. My sense is that there was this great similarity between Britain and the United States in terms of attitude. it was a little different in England. I think women did have a little bit more in terms of what would you call that? Personality influence. But you also see it here in the United States among our first ladies. Dolley Madison certainly was a force of nature, which actually did influence politics. So I think for the first, it's an interesting point. You've given me a new avenue of research.
Slightly off topic, but might fill your research.
Yeah,
Queen
comparative.
Victoria ruled England for most of the 19th century,
Mm,
and that may have made some difference in the attitudes.
hmm Well, certainly our system of laws comes almost lock, stock, and barrel from Britain. That's with the exception of primogeniture, all of our laws pertaining to property and to women, the rights of women come directly from Britain. But yeah, I appreciate that, Dan. Thank you.
Okay. This is proving a longer discussion than usual. Anybody else want to say anything?
I'm curious to know what the backdrops are for both Pat and Liz.
Liz?
Yeah, this is and actually
It's the
my
White
brother-in-law
House.
Bruce, who is on here attending with my sister Alice.
Oh.
He found the image of the 1860 Buchanan White House. Is that my backdrop there? Thank you.
You notice there's no presidential ballroom.
Yes, right.
Oh, that was a mistake.
Your background?
My background is the ages of women kind. Starting from being a child on
I
up.
see.
At the apex, she's a mother of a grown child, and then it goes down on the other side of the bridge to old age. Some of these, and it's really kind of a trope, and you see many versions of it at the end with the woman in the coffin. This is slightly more positive.
Thank you.
So how did you pick the dates to begin and the dates to
can't.
end?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we 2 years ago, Pat and I gave a presentation on Daughters of the Enlightenment from Martha Washington to Louisa Catherine Adams, the wife of John Quincy Adams, and then so we started with this time with Andrew Jackson's administration up to the Civil War.
Yeah, we've actually moved over the course of the talks. We've moved it from the first ladies on up through. I think we've actually made it in other organizations up to the 80s now, and we envision doing a much larger project, a book, for example.
So you're going to continue? Is that the idea?
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
So, and in fact, that was what it was. It's kind of a luxury to give talks on different eras because we've gone to the future of this period in talks elsewhere. So that's kind of what set me off on my particular down my rabbit hole about this. Looking at the gaps in women's history.
Yeah, I
Well,
appreciate
having
that.
heard all these different ladies already, I feel like, okay, then I'm going to be totally confused by the end when you finish, because there's a lot of people to remember and a lot of influences and everything.
There are. History can be messy, I think.
Any more comments from anyone?
I just want to say I really appreciate in many ways filling the gaps
Yeah.
and the different types of women, the women working in the farms, the slave women, unslaved women, who the organizations, all of this, it's a big project and it really does help fill gaps for me anyway.
Thank you, Lynn.
not in
Yeah,
America.
unfortunately, we couldn't go into a lot of detail. You know, we just skimmed the surface for this talk, but
It's a lot.
there's a
Very
lot
impressive.
more in there. Yeah, every
Yeah,
one of
very
those
impressive.
subjects could be a book in itself.
Yeah. And a lot
Yes.
more about those first ladies as well.
Mhm,
Yeah.
And Margaret
Yeah.
Eden as well.
mhm.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah, it's
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank
Right.
you.
Once again, thank you, Liz and Pat, for a very interesting and entertaining session, which held everybody's attention, which was quite remarkable.
Oh,
Well, thank
Next
you all for
month-
your patience.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just two housekeeping notes. This has been recorded and will be available as soon as Jim gets the recording and will post it on the IHS website. Liz has also generously volunteered, I think, partly by default, to take notes on this, so this will be written in the newsletter. Next presentation will be Saturday, September 20th, as always at 10 a.m. Pacific. Maria Sokovich will talk about the making of a pilgrimage at Fort Ross from 1925 to 2025. So everybody should look forward to that. And as a future note, in all subsequent announcements, I will not only have a Zoom link, but a phone link, because somebody has asked for it, although it doesn't seem to have been used. Again, I'm going to stop recording.